While I go and stand up on my pedestal, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a history lesson. Did you know that this flag right here is known as the African Revolutionary Flag? It was adopted by a paramilitary organization known as the ANC, which declared war on the South African government and won. The commander of the ANC was Nelson Mandela. ANC stands for the African National Congress. They're now the government of South Africa. Oh, and here's another one for you. You heard the motto, power to the people. You know what the real motto was? All power to all the people. Stop thinking we're talking about black lives only. Now, since the creation of the Ministry of Truth and Asshole Mode activated, there's been just a few topics that I've avoided touching base on. And for most of these topics, there's a good reason. One topic I never touched on is religion, but that's because I feel you gotta earn that topic around here. If you're not if you're not perceptive enough to follow what goes on in the world, you are exponentially incapable of grasping such a reality demolishing conversation. Another topic I haven't touched on really is 9/11. But that's for a very simple reason. There's simply not enough evidence known to the public to make an informed decision in whether or not it was a genuine terror attack or an inside job. And even with the declassification of the 28 redacted pages, the answer is still clear as mud, though it might make some of you feel a little better to know that those 28 pages, when they were declassified, they proved that both the FBI and the CIA have suspicions that it was actually an inside job. They just couldn't prove it because nobody on either side cooperated with their investigations. But the most obvious and most important topic that I've shied away from for over these years on this group is racism in North America. And there's a lot of reasons I avoided this topic, starting with the fact that, given the fact that I was down below from 2011 to 2015, my participation in the discussion would have been a little late or outdated. Another reason was I genuinely thought that I knew nothing that nobody else didn't know. I thought I had nothing to contribute because I thought everything I knew was common knowledge in both white society and communities of color. Another reason is because I spent half my life with my white family in a white neighborhood in a predominantly white city. I've always been subconsciously worried that many people of color may not share my points of view. However, so many accusations of criminal actions, terror plots, reverse racism, and all that shit, I've come to realize that there's a lot behind my culture and the Black Lives Matter movement that most people younger than 33 know nothing about. For example, did you know that in Miami, Florida, in 2013, a 30-year-old black man named Jefferson Zulu stalked a 17-year-old white child back to his home? 17-year-old Timothy McNamara. I always have trouble with that name. Timothy McNamara confronted Zulu, and Zulu, carrying a concealed Glock 9mm, shot the child to death right in front of Timothy's mother. Zulu was found not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. And more recently, during the pandemic, 17-year-old Khalil Rhodes traveled from Chicago, Illinois with an illegal AK-47 to the state of Michigan during the anti-lockdown protests earlier in May. He had allegedly shot two white protesters with his illegal assault rifle. And now the Black Lives Matter organization applauds young Mr. Rhodes with being a hero for defending himself 2 state borders away from his home. Now, if you're white, chances are you hear these stories and your blood boils about as hot as it did when O.J. Simpson was acquitted. And if you're black, you're probably thinking, man, these dumb niggas are fucking up our cause. Then you're probably going to shake it off, because even though these stories are horrible, it's nice to see the token black guy get away with appropriating white privilege to the highest level. once in a blue moon. Does this sound like a fair assumption of what both sides of these stories are probably thinking? If so, then you ignorant, selfish ass motherfuckers need to do some soul searching, because both of those stories, I just changed the names and identities of both the victims and the killers. Care to take a guess at who those people really were? Now, if you're anything like me, you probably guessed that white people had a fucking parade over Kyle Rittenhouse killing 2 innocent people, and shook their heads, but smiled and laughed when they found out George Zimmerman sold the gun that killed a 17-year-old child for 450 grand at an auction. So forgive me for thinking, if what I guessed is true, in how some of these people think, that they, in very black and white terms, openly support child killers. And as someone who's done 5 years in a federal penitentiary, I can promise you the pen is full of guys like me who feel that the lease on your life as a supporter of child killers, I don't give a fuck what race you are, should be revoked. You know better than the child killers themselves, so fuck them and fuck you. Especially since some of you double-standard dipshits probably think you know more about my people's history and culture than we do. Tell me something, Canadian white people. When's the last time you went to school and learned about the native residential schools? Chances are you didn't, but most of you, I'm not a racist, but assholes, swallowed the salty loads Don Cherry busted in your face in 2007 when he said that the native protests were being perpetuated by over-entitled alcoholic freeloaders that lied about systemic racism before your government ever dared to admit that they supported raping and torturing kids who didn't speak English, all the way up until 1973, 15 years before I was born. Keep that in mind. Of the 14 years that I've been to school, I never once witnessed a lesson in Black history in Canadian schools, even during Black History Month. So I always found it funny when smart white people would ask, why don't we have White History Month to make it fair? If you need me to answer that for you, then you're a lost cause. You should have had a brain transplant coming out your mama's cunt. In fact, I learned more about my roots in North America being voluntold to work at a museum in Calgary, Alberta. In fact, I learned more about my roots in North America being voluntold to work at a museum in Calgary, of all places, than most young black folk my age ever learned in their lifetimes. And Calgary was famous for a YouTube video entitled Racism Reborn. There I am in the video. There's my father, and my mentor for how I started getting into music. Ryan Perez, CEO of Hustle Zone TV. That was 2003. Now, ever since Kyle Rittenhouse, I noticed something not just about white people, but black millennials and beyond. None of them know the whole story behind why we still fight for equality. No. One thing that absolutely fucking floored me was the fact that in the information age, where your average white 30-something has seen at least 2 Michael Moore documentaries, the YouTube video Zeitgeist, and often quotes the hashtag 9/11 was an inside job, almost none of these woke people have ever heard of Operation COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. So, I'm going to give you a brief lesson in what the fuck those 2 words even mean. In 1953, the FBI published a full investigation into the Communist Party and the Negro, codenamed COINTELPRO, short for Communist Infiltration. They were looking for evidence that the civil rights movement's organizations and leaders could potentially be turned by Soviet double agents. In the declassified documents, the FBI was surprised and relieved that almost all of the pro-black organizations in the US had successfully prevented Soviet spies from infiltrating their ranks. And this is where many intelligent white people stopped reading, because it was the truth. Martin Luther King was not a commie traitor. He just wanted his black children's lives to matter just as much as white children's lives. Sound familiar? But Because those intelligent white folks stopped reading at COINTELPRO, they missed COINTELPRO. You see, immediately after learning that the civil rights movement was not a communist takeover, the FBI went out of their way to convince white America that it actually was a communist takeover. That's right. They knew they were lying, and they knew they were lying to you. Hell, they even sent death threats to Martin Luther King Jr. Basically, the letter would say, you have 30 days to kill yourself. And hell, we've even taken the time to write out a suicide note for you to use. I'm not bullshitting. This was disclosed in the JFK declassifications. FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency straight up collaborated with South American cartels to import heroin into the country to destroy the Black Panther Party for self-defense. You know, that thing that everybody says is a terrorist group now. And this is true. The National Rifle Association even buddied up with the supposedly cross-dressing former director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and actually supported gun control laws to prevent black people from carrying them. Remember how the NRA, they're against all types of gun control laws? This was the only time in history that they were ever for them. Now, most white people who learn this shit either think that I'm lying about it, even though the United States government admitted to it in the 90s, or they just shrug it off because, by the very definition, that means that shit's never going to change. We're fighting a lost cause. Meanwhile, most black people who learn this shit realize that a lot of this shit that the Black Lives Matter movement gets accused of is recycled reruns of lies and propaganda that were used in the 1960s because white people seem to be dumb enough to believe the shit a second time. In other words, what's happening right now is officially COINTELPRO version 2.0. And the black people who knew this shit before 2013 were the ones who said Black Lives Matter is not a movement or an organization. It is a simple truth that we all agree on. That is why, after the deaths of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and 12-year-old Tamir Rice, the black community all across the continent insisted on no organizational hierarchy, no founders, no chapters, and no demands. Because the last time we started organizations and started marching, the United States government tried to make our best-looking leaders look like evil, white-hating rapists and would-be genocidal maniacs. They assassinated the leaders of all the organizations, and many white supporters of our movements were accused of communism, which back in the day translated to a criminal charge of treason, which is punishable by death. Y'all white people want to know why white people were never allowed to join black groups? First off, in the southern states back then, it was illegal for whites and blacks to integrate in any definition of the word. And secondly, we refused to allow you to join because if you did, your government would have imprisoned you and executed you, and then cut off our dicks and stuffed them in our mouths while we hung from poplar trees. And then they would accuse us of having your blood on our hands. You fucking get it yet? While I'm proud to see high school students here in Canada taking up the torch of freedom where others were forced to fall, y'all young brothers and sisters out there need to understand there's a reason your elders told you not to do that. And now, unfortunately, you see why they said it. The problem is, the people you're trying to reach don't know or don't care, and I apologize for being cynical to the point of sounding racist, but I can guarantee the people that you haven't reached yet, you never will. Because it don't matter if Black Lives Matter, if to them, you don't matter. So where do we go from here? If I told you my personal opinion, I would probably get my money's worth from all the military-grade defensive countermeasures that I've invested in all these years. And half my black family would probably distance themselves from me for good reason. Because if you really want to know what I think needs to be done, then I would suggest researching the life, words, and death of one Tupac Amaru Shakur, who was a son of a former high-ranking Black Panther who knew that the Panthers and the origins behind the Crips and the Bloods were interconnected, and managed to forge a moment of peace between street gangs until he was killed under a code of ethics that he had named Thug Life. The hate you give little infants fucks everyone. If anybody here learned something new, and I believe that I am being honest, thank you for taking the time to hear me on this. For those who think I'm lying, you're really fucking stupid. Especially if you can't be bothered to go look up for your fucking white history on this topic, your damn self. For those who learn nothing new, I need you to understand. Our history has been lost in the fog of war. Most people don't know the important details. They just know the CNN documentaries and shit. Your patience is a high-value commodity right now, because I've lost the eyes and ears of even my closest peers because I failed to realize that an adversary who doesn't know the history behind what he fights for or against is not always an enemy. COINTELPRO was so successful that you can pretty much consider it to still be in active operation to this day. Forget the version 2.0 shit. What J. Edgar Hoover commissioned was a long-term, late-game strategy that is winning right now. We need to make sure that, just as the natives got their history to be canonized by our government and our education systems, we need to do the same. Otherwise, the Black Lives Matter movement will just be nothing more than a fraudulent distraction. Knowledge is power. Each one teach one. Going after the cops is a losing strategy. Just ask Fred Hampton and Huey Newton. Read 1984 by George Orwell and recognize that Orwell's version of the Ministry of Truth, not this one. Trust me, I don't like that one, so I make mine the opposite. But his version of the Ministry of Truth is exactly what our education system is right now here in Canada and in many parts of America. That is where we need to focus our efforts, even if we ever want to reach the cops before they become cops. Spread the word, please. Because if we don't, then all this shit's been a waste of time. And I'm not talking about making this video either. All power to all people. Not just the ones you think matter. Oh, and before you make any judgments on that whole thug life bullshit from Tupac, I suggest you read the code of ethics behind it. It's a 28-point code of rules, you know, such as civilians are not a target, children are not a target, don't sell dope in schools, shit like that.
Does that point to the vigilante attitude? I think that's what the jurors are going to
know
have to
your
decide.
shit
They're
before
gonna
you
have
try to
decide
tell
if
us we
this is
don't
a
know
guy
our
who's just
side.
beaten up and therefore doesn't have the wherewithal at that moment
Head up,
emotionally to
eyes and
care
ears
about this
open.
dead person on the ground, or
You know
is this
who
a guy
said
who's callous and doesn't care
Gangsta.
and maybe even a little bit proud of having shot him because he tells the
Catch
guy,
y'all
tell
later.
my wife I shot someone.
If I were gunned down, what would you think of me? Did I deserve it, or was it a tragedy? Would you believe what they say about me is crime fiction, or would discovering the truth become your mission? If I died, would you seek justice? Would you find out what happened, or just let them diss? If they said I had it coming, would you agree with them and say I must have backed it up, that I never feared them? If I were gunned down, would they call me a crook and ignore my children and how sad they all look? What about my education, or how well that I spoke? Or would they say I used drugs and focused just on the smoke? If I died in 10 years, would they look back to now like my time in the pen, explain my death somehow? Will my pictures show me smiling, holding all of my kids, or wearing masks and rags with smoke leaving my lips if I were gunned down?
When you ask the question, why wait so long? Why didn't they come out with this information in the first, second, third day? It was because they were putting the story together. That is why. The police took 5 or 6 days to put this story together, to make a foundation for what they are going to create as this man's defense. Because I think what they do know is that an arrest is going to happen.
If I were gunned down, what would you remember the most? That I fought for my kids, or that I call myself ghost? Would they say I went to school and I had nowhere to sleep, or that I was kicked out and arrested for trying to eat? If I die in the street and the only real reason was they say I got a badge and gun, so you better comply, son. But then I ask for their name and badge and I get clapped. Will you say a stupid thug should've never even asked? If I were gunned down, would you think it's sad that my children grow up without a father, or project my sins on my daughter? The main reason I ask is cause I gotta know what to say to my kids for when this dog has his day. If I died, will my son get to call them out, or will they be at risk, singled out while in the crowd? If they say my kids are persons of interest for shouting pig, will you turn them in or finally see this game is rigged? If I were gunned down.
No, as the father of a black son, he just said a very true thing. He said there are many families in this city who ask every night, is my child safe? And not just from crime and violence, but from the very people they want to have faith in as their protectors. I know. How dare he spread a myth that is only corroborated by every single black person ever?
Again, you have to be logical. You know, if I know that in this hotel room they have food every day, and I'm knocking on the door every day to eat, and they open the door, let me see the party, let me see like them throwing salami all over. I mean, just like throwing food around, but they're telling me there's no food. You know what I'm saying? Every day, I'm standing outside trying to sing my way in. You know what I'm saying? We are hungry, please let us in. We are hungry, please let us in. After about a week, that song is gonna change to we hungry, we need some food. After 2-3 weeks, it's like, you know, give me all the food, breaking out the door. And after a year, you just like, you know what I'm saying? I'm picking the lock, coming through the door blasting, you know what I'm saying? It's like you hungry, you reach your level, you don't want any more. We asked 10 years ago. We was asking with Panthers, we was asking with them, you know, the civil rights movement. We was asking, you know, now those people that were asking, they're all dead and in jail. So now what do you think we're gonna do?